Okay, so let's get a little more in depth on the anatomy of the spinal cord, and let's look more at the ventral and or anterior roots versus the dorsal posterior roots. The ventral anterior roots, remember, that's where motor axons are going to be exiting from that are going to the skeletal muscles, whereas the dorsal side is the recipient of the sensory neurons. These are joined together in the periphery of the body in spinal nerves. Now, in the sensory pathway, there are unipolar neurons where, recall, the cell body has only one projection from it, one cellular extension that splits after it leaves the cell body and splits into a part that goes towards the surface of the body, towards the skin, and then the other one that projects towards the spinal cord. Let's look at this in a little more detail here. And this is absolutely one of the best presentations of the dorsal root ganglion I've ever seen. So here we are right in this section where the red arrow is. And what we're seeing are these unipolar neurons. You can see several of them. I mean, there's hundreds and thousands in this dorsal root ganglion. And then you see the process coming out of the cell body and it splits. One going towards the posterior or dorsal horn of the spinal cord, the other one heading out to the extremities to gather information, to get the sensory information. So sensory information is going to be conveyed in, it's going to go past and on into the spinal cord. All right, so this is the dorsal root ganglion through which all its sensory information is going to be sent through. This is the collection site. The motor roots, the motor axons are all progressing through here, and they join together to form that spinal nerve. So there's the definition of a ganglion. This is the dorsal root ganglion. We see the bundle right here, and these are the sensory components heading towards this dorsal root of the spinal cord. Now, when the motor nerves come out from the ventral root, they're either going to go through what's called the dorsal ramus or the ventral ramus. The dorsal ramus will contain the visceral motor fibers that are heading towards the back, while the ventral ramus will contain all the other. So the ones heading to the interior aspect of the body as well as the sides. As you might guess, the ventral ramus would be much larger than the dorsal ramus would. Now, they also carry the sensory information components from these areas of the body as well. So let's look at this division. So here we see the dorsal root ganglion, the ventral root, their combination into the spinal nerve, and then once the spinal nerve forms, we're going to have the dorsal or posterior ramus that's projecting to the back of the body, much thinner than this anterior ramus that's going to the sides and the anterior aspect of the body. All right. There are also a couple of structures here that will be important later on in A&P 2, the very first chapter. These things are called communicating rami, and we'll discuss those in much more detail in A&P 2. Don't worry too much about these two structures yet. But right here, the anterior branch or ramus versus the dorsal ramus. Let's look at it a little more closely, and we see the anterior ramus projecting and providing nerve supply to the anterior aspects and the lateral aspects of the body, while the dorsal ramus supplies the posterior aspects. And this drawing doesn't quite do it justice. This one is much thinner. The posterior ramus then is the anterior ramus. There's a disease condition called polio. It's caused by the polio virus. I'm sure you've been inoculated against polio, and what happens is it destroys the motor neurons in the brainstem and anterior horn of the spinal cord, so you don't get any motor outputs, and you get extreme lack of muscle coordination that occurs. And so you'll get pain, weakness. That's the first aspect of polio. I encourage you to look up a YouTube video on it. There's some really good ones out there. In fact, I think I may have one referenced in the face-to-face PowerPoint. If not, though, by all means, you should check out that. Now, eventually it leads to paralysis, atrophy of the muscles. It's a very, very serious disorder that, of course, can lead to death. My brother, I can remember my dad always talking about how they were in a trip through Detroit in the mid-50s, mid to late 50s, and how there was a big polio scare then. It was very rampant in that part of the country, and they were just glad to get out of there. Fortunately, nobody got affected by it, but it does spread by fecal contamination of water. Another major disorder associated with motor nerve function is the myotropic lateral sclerosis, sometimes also called Lou Gehrig's disease. This is when your motor neurons are destroyed, and of course, as a consequence, the muscles begin to atrophy. The sclerosis part comes from the fact that regions of your spinal cord begin scarring. Your nerves, your myelin sheath begins scarring in this region of the central nervous system. And so you can see all of these particular aspects. If you don't know about Lou Gehrig, he was called the Iron Man of baseball. He played over 2,000 games in a row without missing one. And then the great irony of all was that after his retirement, he was diagnosed with this condition where he slowly disintegrated, for want of a better word. Fortunately, your intellectual functions remain completely intact. It doesn't affect the brain, but it does affect muscle activity and the spinal cord nerves. Now, we can actually diagnose spinal cord issues by examining what areas of the skin and body are affected. And so this is called the dermatome map, and you get a graph of the regions that are supplied by the different nerves. If you're lacking nerve supply to that particular area, then you won't have sensations associated with that specific nerve. Now, dermatomes can overlap quite a bit. This shows you a rather sharp line in between, say, T11, T12 here. So what this means is thoracic 11 nerve supplies this region in the posterior aspect of the body, down here in the anterior aspect of the body. This region is supplied by nerve T12, while in the anterior aspect, it's T12 is over here. But they can overlap quite a bit, so you generally allow for an overlap of two other nerves. So if we had problems in this dermatome, we would suspect it's either T9, T10, or T11 if the nerve damage, or if you were having a problem with sensation in this region of the body. So the overall scheme and layout is, here we have a patch of skin. We have receptors that are detecting sensory information, which is getting supplied. Here's your unipolar nerve cell body, right? One process extends out to the surface. The other process extends into the spinal cord. That information will be transmitted all along this axon and will be sent into an ascending tract, and depends on what exactly the information is, whether it's touch, 2-point discrimination, pain, temperature, whatever it may be, whether it enters through the posterior right tracts, lateral right tracts, or even potentially anterior right tracts, although that's not the case in this particular aspect. Motor information will come down into this anterior great horn and be transmitted at the ventral root via a spinal nerve, and that will go to the skeletal muscle for actions. Don't worry about the green line yet, not a problem. Worry about that in chapter 15 when you get to A and P2. See you for the next video.